The door burst open before Elsie Hartley could even set down her broom, and a gust of freezing rain rushed into the narrow hallway of the inn. She turned, ready to scold whoever had let the storm inside, but the words caught in her throat. A man stood swaying in the doorway, his coat torn at the shoulder, his face pale as candle wax, blood soaking through the fabric near his ribs. He looked at her with wide, desperate eyes, took one more step, and collapsed onto the wooden floor. For a moment, Elsie simply stared, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it over the storm outside. Then instinct took over. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. His skin was cold, but he was breathing, shallow and ragged. "Someone help me," she called out, though she already knew no one would come. The innkeeper, Mrs. Dawson, had gone to bed early, warning the staff not to open the doors for anyone after dark. Strangers on the road at this hour usually meant trouble, robbers fleeing the king's soldiers, or worse, deserters with nothing left to lose. But this man did not look like a criminal. His boots were fine leather, his coat lined with a fabric too rich for a common traveler, and his hands, despite the blood and dirt, were smooth, untouched by hard labor. Elsie glanced toward the stairs, weighing her choices in an instant. If Mrs. Dawson found a wounded stranger bleeding on her clean floor, she would throw him back into the storm without a second thought. There was no time to explain, no time to ask permission. She slid her arms under his shoulders and pulled with all her strength, dragging him toward the back door that led to the stables. He was heavier than she expected, but fear gave her strength she did not know she had. Rain lashed against her face as she hauled him across the muddy yard, her thin shoes sinking into the wet earth. By the time she reached the small room above the stables where she slept, her arms burned and her breath came in gasps. She kicked the door open and pulled him inside, letting him down gently onto the straw-covered floor. The room was barely large enough for a bed and a small table, but it was warm, at least warmer than outside, and it was hers. No one would think to look for a stranger here. She latched the door and turned to him, her hands shaking as she examined the wound more closely. It was deep, but not so deep that it would kill him quickly. If she could stop the bleeding in time, she had only one candle left. It sat on the table, half burned, the last of what she had been given for the entire week. She was supposed to make it last until Sunday, but there was no way to see the wound properly in the dark, and she needed light if she hoped to help him survive the night. Her hands trembled as she reached for the flint. She told herself it was foolish, wasting her only candle on a stranger who might die anyway, a stranger who could bring soldiers to her door if he truly was a criminal. But when she looked at his face again, pale and helpless, something in her chest tightened. She could not leave him in the dark to die alone. The candle flickered to life, casting a small, warm glow across the room. Elsie tore a strip of cloth from an old shirt and pressed it hard against his wound, trying to remember everything her mother had once taught her about tending injuries. Her mother had been sick for 2 years now, confined to their small cottage at the edge of the village, but before the illness took her strength, she had been known for her skill with herbs and bandages. Elsie had learned by watching, by helping, never imagining she would need such knowledge for a stranger who had appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a storm. The man groaned, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at her with confusion, then pain, then something like gratitude. "Where?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Where am I?" "You are safe," Elsie said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. "Do not move. You are hurt badly." He tried to sit up anyway, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. Elsie pushed him back down gently but firmly. "I said do not move. If you tear that wound open further, I cannot promise I will be able to stop the bleeding a second time." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he stopped struggling and let his head fall back against the folded blanket she had placed beneath him. His eyes studied her face in the candlelight, taking in every detail as though trying to memorize her. "Who are you?" he asked. "Elsie," she said simply. "I work here, at the inn. And you? What happened to you? Were you attacked on the road?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elsie noticed something odd. Most people, when asked what had happened to them, answered without thinking, the words spilling out naturally. But this man seemed to be choosing his words carefully, as though deciding how much of the truth he was willing to share with a stranger. "I was riding," he said finally. "There was an ambush. I do not remember much after that. I ran, I think. I do not know how long I have been walking." "You were bleeding heavily," Elsie said, continuing to press the cloth against his side. "Whoever did this to you meant to make sure you did not survive." He flinched. Whether from her words or from the pain, she could not tell. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do not tell anyone I am here. Not the innkeeper, not the soldiers, not anyone. Elsie paused, studying his face. Every instinct told her this was dangerous. Hiding a wounded stranger from soldiers, especially if he was running from the law, could bring terrible trouble upon her and her mother. She had heard stories of villagers punished simply for giving bread to the wrong traveler, and yet, looking into his eyes, she saw no cruelty there, only fear and exhaustion. "Why should I trust you?" she asked quietly. "You should not," he admitted. "You owe me nothing. I am asking for kindness I have not earned." His honesty surprised her. Most men in his position would have lied, would have spun a story to win her sympathy. Instead, he simply told her the truth, that he was asking for something he had no right to ask. "I will not tell anyone," Elsie said finally, more to herself than to him, as if speaking the promise aloud made it binding. "But you must stay quiet. If Mrs. Dawson hears voices from this room, she will come to investigate, and I do not know what she will do if she finds you here." He nodded weakly, his eyelids growing heavy. Elsie worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could with the small amount of clean water and cloth she had. She had no proper medicine, only a few dried herbs her mother had given her long ago, kept in a small tin beneath her bed for emergencies. She crushed them between her fingers and pressed them against the wound, hoping they would help slow the bleeding and prevent infection. The candle burned lower with each passing hour, its flame growing smaller, the wax dripping down its sides in slow, steady streams. Elsie watched it with a growing sense of dread, knowing that when it went out, she would be left in complete darkness with a wounded stranger whose fate she could not predict. "Talk to me," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "Stay awake. If you fall asleep, I cannot tell if you are simply resting or if something worse is happening." He opened his eyes again, focusing on her face with visible effort. "What would you like me to talk about?" "Anything," Elsie said. "Tell me where you were riding to. Tell me about your family. Anything to keep your mind alert." He was quiet for a long moment, and Elsie wondered if he had drifted off despite her efforts. Then he spoke, his voice soft and distant, as though recalling a memory from far away. "I had a brother once," he said. "He died when I was young. I do not remember his face clearly anymore, only the sound of his laughter. My mother says I have his eyes." Elsie listened, her hand still working carefully at his side, replacing the soaked cloth with a fresh strip torn from her own shawl. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I lost my father when I was 12. My mother has been ill since, and I have cared for her ever since, along with working here, to earn enough for food and medicine." "That must be difficult," he said, his eyes studying her with new interest. "To carry so much responsibility so young." "It is what it is," Elsie replied, a note of quiet resignation in her voice. "There is no use complaining about things that cannot be changed. I do what needs to be done, and I am grateful for what little I have." He fell silent again, watching her work with an expression she could not quite read. There was something in the way he looked at her, not with pity, as many wealthier travelers did when they learned of her circumstances, but with genuine curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. The candle flickered violently, threatening to go out entirely. Elsie's heart sank as she watched the flame struggle against the small draft that crept through the gaps in the wooden walls. She cupped her hand around it protectively, shielding it as best she could, praying it would last just a little longer. "You should save that," the stranger said weakly, noticing her worry. "I have already cost you enough tonight. Do not waste your last light on me." "It is not a waste," Elsie said firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her voice. "I would rather sit in the dark tomorrow night than let you die in the dark tonight. A candle can always be replaced, a life cannot." Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of emotion so brief she almost missed it. He looked at her as though she had said something extraordinary, though to Elsie, it seemed like the simplest truth in the world. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain hammering against the roof of the stable, wind howling through the trees beyond the inn. Elsie worked through the night, checking the wound, changing the cloth, forcing him to stay awake with quiet conversation whenever his eyes grew too heavy. She did not know his name, did not know where he had come from or where he intended to go, only that he needed help, and she was the only one who could give it. As the first hints of dawn began to creep through the small window of her room, the candle finally sputtered and died, leaving them in the pale gray light of early morning. Elsie looked down at the stranger, who had finally fallen into a true, restful sleep, his breathing steady and even for the first time since he had collapsed at her door. She sat back against the wall, exhaustion settling heavily into her bones, and allowed herself a small, tired smile. He was alive. Whatever happened next, whoever he truly was, whatever trouble might follow him to her door, she had done what she could. She had given him warmth in the darkness, light in his final desperate hour, and for now, that was enough. She did not yet know his name. She did not know that the man sleeping quietly on her floor was far more than a wounded traveler caught in a storm. She only knew that something had changed in the small hours of that night, something she could not yet name, but something she suspected would alter the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. The rain outside began to soften into a gentle drizzle, and somewhere in the village beyond, a rooster crowed, announcing the arrival of a new day. Elsie closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself to rest, unaware that far beyond the walls of the small inn, riders were already gathering, searching the countryside for a man who had vanished without a trace. Elsie woke to the sound of someone stirring beside her, and for one confused moment, she forgot where she was, or why her back ached from sleeping upright against the wall. Then memory returned in a rush, and she opened her eyes to find the stranger watching her, his face still pale, but his eyes clearer than they had been the night before. "You are awake," she said, relief flooding through her. "How do you feel?" "Sore," he admitted, shifting slightly and wincing at the movement. "But alive, thanks to you." Elsie moved quickly to check the wound, pulling back the cloth to examine it in the daylight. The bleeding had slowed considerably, and though the skin around the injury was red and swollen, there was no sign of the dark, spreading infection she had feared. Her makeshift treatment had worked, at least for now. "You need real medicine," she said, frowning as she studied the wound. "Herbs and clean cloth can only do so much. If it becomes infected, it could still kill you." "I cannot see a physician," he said quickly, alarm flashing across his face. "If anyone learns I am here, it could mean trouble for both of us." Elsie sat back on her heels, studying him carefully. In the light of day, she could see him more clearly than she had during the chaos of the storm. His jaw was strong, his features sharp and refined in a way that spoke of good breeding, not the rough, weathered look of a farmer or laborer. Even injured and exhausted, there was something commanding in the way he held himself, a quiet authority that seemed at odds with the desperate, frightened man who had collapsed at her door. "Who is looking for you?" she asked. "Tell me the truth this time. If I am to keep hiding you, I deserve to know what danger I am inviting into my life." He hesitated, and once again she saw that careful calculation in his eyes, the weighing of how much to reveal. Finally he sighed, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "There are people who wish me harm," he said. "Powerful people. I cannot tell you more than that, not yet. I am sorry. It is not that I do not trust you. It is that the less you know, the safer you will be if anyone comes asking questions." It was not the answer Elsie wanted, but she understood the logic in it, even if it frustrated her. She had already risked so much for a man whose true name she did not even know, and now she would have to continue doing so blindly, trusting instinct alone. "Very well," she said finally, "but you cannot stay hidden in this room forever. Mrs. Dawson will notice if I do not come down soon to begin my chores, and if she finds you here, there will be no explaining it away." "Then go," he said. "Do your work. I will stay quiet. You have already done more for me than I deserve." Elsie rose reluctantly, casting one last glance at him before slipping out of the room and locking the door behind her with the small key she kept on a string around her neck. She hurried across the muddy yard toward the inn, her mind racing with worry over how she would manage to care for a hidden stranger while continuing her normal duties without arousing suspicion. The morning passed in a blur of scrubbing floors, serving breakfast to the few travelers who had taken shelter from the storm, and stealing away whatever moments she could to check on her secret guest. She brought him small portions of bread and broth, careful not to take so much that Mrs. Dawson would notice the missing food. It meant less for herself, but she pushed the thought aside. He needed strength to heal, and she could manage with less for a few days. By midday, whispers had begun to spread through the village. Elsie heard them first from Hannah, one of the other maids at the inn, who came rushing into the kitchen with wide eyes and a flush of excitement on her cheeks. "Have you heard?" Hannah asked breathlessly. "Soldiers arrived in the village this morning. They say a nobleman has gone missing, attacked on the road not far from here. They are searching every farm, every barn, every inn between here and the capital." Elsie's hands stilled over the dishes she had been washing, her heart suddenly pounding. "A nobleman?" she repeated carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "Do they know who?" "No one is saying for certain," Hannah said, lowering her voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "But some say it is someone very important, someone close to the crown. They say whoever finds him will be greatly rewarded, and whoever is found hiding him will face terrible punishment." The warning in Hannah's words was not lost on Elsie. She forced herself to nod, to appear only mildly curious, though her mind was racing with the implications. Could the man in her room truly be this missing nobleman? It would explain his fine clothes, his careful way of speaking, his refusal to reveal his true identity even to her. "That sounds frightening," Elsie managed to say. "I hope they find him safely." "I hope they find whoever attacked him first," Hannah said with a shudder. "Imagine being ambushed on the open road. It could happen to any of us." Elsie excused herself as soon as she could, claiming she needed to check on the linens, and hurried instead toward the stables, her thoughts spinning wildly. If the man in her room truly was the missing nobleman the soldiers sought, then she was not simply hiding an injured traveler. She was hiding someone whose disappearance had drawn the attention of soldiers, someone whose survival or capture could shift the balance of power in ways she could not begin to understand. She found him sitting up when she entered, his back propped against the wall, looking stronger than he had that morning, though still clearly weakened by his injury. His eyes met hers immediately, and something in her expression must have alarmed him, because he straightened, concern crossing his features. "What is wrong?" he asked. "What has happened?" "Soldiers have arrived in the village," Elsie said, closing the door quickly behind her and lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "They are searching for a missing nobleman, someone attacked on the road. They say he may be close to the crown." The color drained further from his already pale face, and he closed his eyes briefly, as though absorbing a blow. When he opened them again, there was no more pretense in his expression, only weary resignation. "I did not want to involve you in this," he said quietly. "I am sorry, Elsie. I should have found somewhere else to go, somewhere far from any village, but I was losing too much blood, and I could not think clearly enough to plan." "Are you him?" Elsie asked directly, needing to know the truth now more than ever. "Are you the nobleman they are searching for?" He was quiet for a long moment, and she watched the internal struggle play out across his face, the desire to protect her, balanced against the growing impossibility of hiding the truth any longer. Finally he nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Yes," he admitted. "Though I cannot tell you my full name or my true position, not yet. Please understand, it is not distrust that keeps me silent, it is fear, for both of us. If word spreads of who I truly am and where I am hiding, it will not only bring danger to me, but to everyone who has helped me, including you and your mother." Elsie sank down onto the small stool beside the table, her mind reeling with the weight of what she had just learned. She was hiding a nobleman, someone important enough that soldiers had been dispatched to search the entire countryside for him. The danger she had suspected was real, but now it felt far larger and more immediate than she had imagined. "What happened to you on the road?" she asked, truly, no more half answers. "If soldiers come to this inn, I need to know what I am protecting you from." He took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the movement, and began to speak, his voice low and measured, as though even now he was choosing his words with great care. "I was traveling with a small party, on my way to attend to matters at my estate. We were ambushed on the road several miles from here. My guards fought bravely, but we were outnumbered. I do not know if any of them survived. I managed to escape into the forest, but I was wounded in the fighting, and I do not know how long I wandered before I found my way to this inn." "Who would attack you?" Elsie asked. "Who would want you dead badly enough to organize such an ambush?" His expression darkened, and for the first time, Elsie saw something like anger flash across his features, quickly suppressed. "There are those within my own household who stand to gain much from my death," he said carefully. "I have suspected for some time that not everyone around me can be trusted, but I did not expect the betrayal to come so swiftly, or so violently." The implications of his words settled heavily in the small room. Not only was Elsie hiding a nobleman, but she was hiding a man who believed someone close to him, someone within his own household, had orchestrated an attempt on his life. This was no simple matter of robbers on the road. This was something far more dangerous, a conspiracy that reached into the highest circles of power. "You cannot stay here much longer," Elsie said finally, her practical nature overriding her fear. "If the soldiers search every inn along this road, they will eventually come here as well. We need a plan." "I know," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "But I am in no condition to travel far, not yet. The wound needs more time to heal, and I have no horse, no money, nothing but the clothes on my back, most of which are ruined." Elsie thought quickly, running through the limited options available to her. She could not simply move him to another location without arousing suspicion, not while he remained so weak. But keeping him hidden in her small room indefinitely was equally impossible, especially with soldiers actively searching the area. "There is a place," she said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. "An old shepherd's hut on the far edge of the property, past the eastern fields. It has not been used in years, not since old Tobias moved his flock closer to the village. It is hidden from the main road, surrounded by trees. No one would think to look there." "How would I get there without being seen?" he asked. I can barely stand for more than a few minutes without pain. Tonight, when everyone else is asleep, I will help you, Elsie said, her mind already working through the logistics. It is not far, perhaps a 20-minute walk if we go slowly. I can bring you food and supplies there without anyone noticing, far easier than trying to sneak them into this room without Mrs. Dawson eventually becoming suspicious. He studied her for a long moment, an expression of something like wonder crossing his features. Why are you doing this? He asked quietly. You do not know my true name. You do not know if I am telling you the whole truth. You are risking everything, your position here, perhaps even your safety, for a stranger you met only last night. Why? Elsie considered the question seriously, searching for an honest answer, rather than simply offering empty reassurance. Because you needed help, she said finally, and I was the one who could give it. I do not know what that makes me. Foolish perhaps, but I could not have lived with myself if I had turned you away and let you die in the storm. Whatever happens next, whoever you truly are, I do not regret helping you. Something shifted in his expression as she spoke, a softening around his eyes that had nothing to do with his physical pain. You are remarkable, he said softly. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who calculate every kindness, who help only when they expect something in return. I did not think such selflessness still existed in this world. Perhaps you have simply been surrounded by the wrong people, Elsie replied, a small, tired smile tugging at the corners of her mouth despite the gravity of their situation. He laughed softly, though the movement clearly pained him, and Elsie found herself smiling more genuinely in response. Even in the midst of danger and uncertainty, there was something comforting about the easy warmth that had developed between them, a connection that felt strange and unexpected, given how little time had actually passed since they met. The rest of the day crept by slowly, filled with tension as Elsie continued her normal duties while watching for any sign of soldiers approaching the inn. Twice, she caught glimpses of mounted riders passing along the main road, and each time, her heart leapt into her throat, though neither group stopped to investigate the inn itself. As evening fell and the other staff began retiring for the night, Elsie gathered what supplies she could without drawing attention: a blanket, a small amount of food wrapped in cloth, a fresh candle to replace the one she had burned through the previous night. She waited until the inn had fallen completely silent, the only sounds the distant hoot of an owl and the soft rustle of wind through the trees, before slipping back to her room. He was waiting for her, having pulled himself into a sitting position against the wall, determination evident on his face despite the obvious pain the effort caused him. I am ready, he said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty about whether his body would truly cooperate. Elsie helped him to his feet slowly, letting him lean heavily against her, as they made their way out into the cool night air. The moon was hidden behind clouds, providing merciful darkness to conceal their movements as they made their slow, careful way across the eastern fields toward the old shepherd's hut. Every few minutes they paused to let him rest, his breathing labored from the exertion and pain. By the time they reached the small stone hut, hidden among a cluster of trees exactly as Elsie remembered, both of them were exhausted. She helped him settle onto the old straw bedding still left inside from years past, then quickly worked to make the space as comfortable as possible, laying out the blanket and setting the candle on a small wooden shelf built into the wall. This should keep you hidden, she said, surveying their work with satisfaction despite her exhaustion. I will bring food and fresh water each day, and I will check on your wound to make sure it continues to heal properly. I do not know how to thank you, he said, watching her with an expression of deep gratitude. You have risked everything for someone whose very name you do not know. Elsie paused at the doorway, considering his words. Perhaps, she said finally, it is time you told me. If we are to continue this arrangement, I would like to know what to call you, even if you cannot yet tell me everything else. He hesitated only briefly before answering. Alden, he said softly. My name is Alden. Alden, Elsie repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It suits you. She left him then, making her way back across the darkened fields toward the inn, her mind full of questions she still could not answer, and a growing awareness that whatever was happening between them was far more significant than a simple act of charity toward a wounded stranger. As she slipped back into her small room and finally allowed herself to rest, she wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether the soldiers searching the countryside would eventually find their way to her door. The days that followed settled into a careful, secretive rhythm. Elsie rose before dawn each morning, completed as many of her chores as quickly as possible, then slipped away during any spare moment to visit the old shepherd's hut, carrying food, water, and clean cloth for changing Alden's bandages. She grew skilled at moving unnoticed across the eastern fields, learning which paths kept her hidden from view of the main road, and which times of day the other staff were least likely to notice her absence. Alden's wound continued to heal, slowly but steadily, the swelling reducing each day, the color returning gradually to his face. He grew stronger too, able to sit up without pain, then eventually to stand and take a few careful steps around the small hut. But with his returning strength came a restlessness that worried Elsie, a growing urgency in his questions about the soldiers and their search. "Have they given up?" he asked one afternoon, as Elsie changed the bandage around his ribs, pleased to see how well the wound was closing. "It has been nearly a week. Surely they cannot search forever." "They have not given up," Elsie said, her voice tight with worry. "If anything, they seem more determined than ever. Hannah says they have begun questioning villagers directly, asking if anyone has seen a wounded stranger, offering rewards for information." Alden's expression darkened at this news. "Rewards," he repeated bitterly. "Of course. Hunger makes people talk, even good people. If word of a reward spreads far enough, someone will eventually claim to have seen something, whether they truly did or not." "No one here would betray you," Elsie said, though even as she spoke the words, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. She trusted Hannah, trusted the other staff at the inn, but desperation could make people do things they might otherwise never consider, especially when a reward large enough was offered. "You cannot be certain of that," Alden said gently, seeing the doubt in her eyes despite her words. "I do not say this to frighten you further, only to remind you of the danger we are both in. The longer I remain here, the greater the risk grows, not just for me, but for you and your mother as well." Elsie sat back on her heels, studying him carefully in the dim light filtering through the small window of the hut. "What would you have us do instead?" she asked. "You cannot travel yet, not safely. Even if the wound has healed enough to allow movement, you have no horse, no money, no way to reach wherever it is you need to go." "I know," he admitted, frustration evident in his tone. "I am grateful for everything you have done, more grateful than I know how to express. But I cannot shake the feeling that I am placing an unbearable burden upon you, one you did not ask for and do not deserve." "I chose this," Elsie reminded him firmly. "No one forced me to drag you in from the storm that night, or to hide you in this hut, or to bring you food each day at the risk of my own position here. I made these choices freely, and I do not regret them." He studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes. "Why?" he asked again, the same question he had posed days earlier, though this time his tone carried a deeper curiosity. "I understand the initial impulse, to help someone injured and dying at your doorstep. Anyone with a good heart might have done the same in that first moment. But this, continuing to risk everything day after day for a stranger whose true identity you still do not fully know, this is different. This is not simply an act of momentary compassion. This is a choice you renew each and every day." Elsie considered the question seriously, wanting to give him an honest answer rather than a simple, easy response. "I suppose," she said slowly, "it is because you have never once asked me to do more than I was willing to give. You have never demanded, never expected. Every kindness I have shown you, you have received with genuine gratitude, never treating it as something owed to you. That means something to me, more than you perhaps realize." "Most people treat kindness as a transaction," she continued, warming to the subject, "especially those with wealth and position. I have served travelers at the inn who tip generously, but treat the staff as though we are invisible, as though our labor means nothing beyond the service it provides them. You are different. You speak to me as though my thoughts, my opinions, actually matter to you." Alden's expression softened considerably at her words, and for a moment, the weight of fear and urgency that had settled over their conversation seemed to lift slightly. "They do matter to me," he said quietly, "more than you know. In truth, Elsie, these past days, hidden away in this small hut, waiting for my wound to heal and wondering if soldiers or worse might find me at any moment, have also been some of the most genuine conversations I have had in years. Everyone in my previous life speaks to me with careful calculation, always aware of my position, always thinking of what they might gain from our interactions. You speak to me as though I am simply a person, nothing more, nothing less. Perhaps that is because, to me, you are simply a person," Elsie replied. "I do not yet know your full story, Alden. I do not know your true position or the powerful people you say wish you harm. To me, you are the man I found bleeding at my door, the man I have nursed back to health, the man who tells me stories of his childhood and asks about my mother's health with what seems like genuine concern. That is enough for me to care what happens to you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while after that, the only sounds the soft rustle of wind through the trees outside, and the occasional distant call of a bird. Elsie finished securing the fresh bandage and began packing away her supplies, aware that she needed to return to the inn before her absence became too noticeable. "Tell me about your mother," Alden said suddenly, as she prepared to leave. "You mention her often, but you have never told me much about her illness, or what it is she needs that you struggle to provide." Elsie paused, surprised by the question, but touched by his interest. "She has a weakness in her lungs," she explained. "It began 2 winters ago, after a particularly harsh cold that never seemed to fully leave her chest. Some days she is stronger, able to sit up and even walk a little around our cottage. Other days, she can barely draw breath without pain. The physician in the village says there is medicine that could help her, herbs from the eastern markets that are known to ease the suffering, but they are expensive, far beyond what I can afford on a maid's wages." "How much would such medicine cost?" Alden asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "More than I earn in several months," Elsie said, a note of weary resignation in her voice. "I have saved what little I can, but it is slow progress, and each winter, I fear it may be her last if I cannot find a way to afford proper treatment sooner." Alden was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "If I am ever able to repay you for your kindness," he said finally, "know that securing your mother's health will be among my very first priorities. You have given so much for a stranger who could offer nothing in return. I intend to change that, should fate allow me the chance." Elsie smiled softly, though she did not fully believe such a promise could ever come to pass. Even if Alden survived, even if he returned safely to whatever powerful position he held, she doubted a nobleman would truly remember a simple maid once he was restored to his former life, surrounded once again by wealth and comfort and the countless demands of his station. But she appreciated the sentiment nonetheless, the kindness in his words even if she suspected they might never be fulfilled. "You should rest," she said, rising to her feet and gathering the last of her supplies. "I will return tomorrow with more food, and hopefully more news about the soldiers' movements. Try to regain as much strength as you can. The sooner you are able to travel safely, the sooner this danger will pass for both of us." He nodded, watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher as she moved toward the door of the hut. "Elsie," he said, just before she stepped outside. She turned back, waiting. "Thank you," he said simply, though the depth of feeling in his voice conveyed far more than the simple words themselves. "For everything." She offered him a small smile before slipping out into the fading afternoon light, making her careful way back across the fields toward the inn, her mind full of thoughts about the strange, unexpected bond that had formed between herself and the mysterious man she had saved. The following days brought increasing tension to the village. The soldiers, led by a stern captain named Garrett Voss, expanded their search to include every barn, cellar, and outbuilding within a wide radius of the main road. Elsie watched with growing anxiety as mounted patrols passed closer and closer to the inn, their questions to travelers and villagers alike growing more pointed and insistent. One evening, as she served drinks in the common room of the inn, she overheard Captain Voss himself questioning Mrs. Dawson about any strangers who might have sought shelter recently. Her heart pounded as she strained to hear the conversation while appearing to focus entirely on her work. "We have had no strangers here, Captain," Mrs. Dawson said firmly, and Elsie felt a rush of relief that her employer, at least, had no knowledge of the secret she had been keeping. Only regular travelers passing through on their usual routes, nothing out of the ordinary. "If you see anything unusual," Captain Voss said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "anyone injured, anyone behaving strangely, you are to report it immediately. The man we seek is dangerous, and those who harbor him will face severe consequences." The word dangerous struck Elsie like a physical blow. She glanced up briefly, catching Captain Voss's eye by accident, and forced herself to maintain a calm, disinterested expression despite the panic rising in her chest. Was Alden truly dangerous, as the captain suggested, or was this simply a tactic to discourage anyone who might otherwise be tempted to offer him shelter? She waited until the soldiers had left the inn before slipping away on the pretense of gathering firewood, hurrying instead toward the eastern fields to warn Alden of what she had overheard. She found him sitting outside the hut, enjoying the fresh evening air, his strength clearly continuing to improve with each passing day. "Soldiers came to the inn," she said breathlessly, sitting down beside him. "Captain Voss himself. He questioned Mrs. Dawson directly, asked if any strangers had sought shelter. He called you dangerous, Alden. He said those who harbor you will face severe consequences." Alden's face grew pale, though not from physical weakness this time. "I feared this might happen," he said grimly. "They are growing more aggressive in their search, which means they suspect I am still somewhere in this region. We must be more careful than ever." "Are you truly dangerous?" Elsie asked directly, needing to know the truth. Is that simply a tactic to frighten people into compliance, or is there some truth to what the captain said? Alden met her eyes steadily. I have never harmed an innocent person in my life, he said firmly. Whatever danger I represent exists only to those who would see me removed from my position through violence and betrayal. If the captain calls me dangerous, it is likely because those who orchestrated the ambush against me wish to paint me as a threat, to justify whatever explanation they intend to offer for my disappearance or eventual death. You believe someone wants people to think you are already dead, Elsie said slowly, understanding dawning in her mind. That is why they are searching so intensely, not simply to rescue you, but to prevent you from returning and revealing the truth about what truly happened. Precisely, Alden confirmed, his expression grim. If I remain missing long enough, presumed dead, whoever orchestrated the ambush will be free to claim whatever position or advantage my absence provides them. My survival threatens their plans significantly. The gravity of their situation settled more heavily upon Elsie than ever before. This was not simply a matter of hiding an injured stranger until he recovered enough to travel. This was a dangerous political conspiracy, one that could have far-reaching consequences depending on how it ultimately resolved. And she found herself caught directly in the middle of it, bound by a promise of secrecy to a man whose true identity and position remained largely unknown to her. What will you do? She asked. Once you are strong enough to travel, where will you go? Back to wherever you came from, to confront whoever betrayed you? I must, Alden said firmly. I cannot remain in hiding forever, and I cannot allow those responsible for the ambush to continue believing they have succeeded in eliminating me. But I will need help, Elsie. Someone I trust completely, someone who can perhaps carry word to allies I still have, people who remain loyal despite the danger. Who would that be? Elsie asked. Alden hesitated, clearly weighing how much more to reveal. There is a man, he said finally, an old friend, someone who has served my family for many years. If I could send word to him, discreetly, without alerting anyone else to my survival, he would know how to proceed safely. How would we contact him without risking discovery? Elsie asked, already beginning to think through the practical challenges of such a task. I do not know yet, Alden admitted. I need more time to think, to plan carefully. A single mistake could prove fatal, not just for me, but for you as well, should our connection ever be discovered. They sat together in silence for a while, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Despite the danger surrounding them, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, Elsie found a strange sense of peace in these quiet moments with Alden, a connection that felt increasingly significant with each passing day. Whatever happens, Alden said softly, breaking the silence, I want you to know that meeting you has changed something in me, Elsie. I came from a world where genuine kindness is rare, where trust is a luxury few can afford. You have shown me that such things still exist, even in the smallest, simplest acts, sharing a last candle with a dying stranger, risking everything to help someone who could offer nothing in return. Elsie felt her cheeks warm at his words, an unfamiliar flutter in her chest that she did not quite know how to name. You give me too much credit, she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Anyone with a conscience would have done the same. I do not believe that is true, Alden said, shaking his head gently. I have known many people with wealth and status who possess no true conscience at all, and I have known people with very little who possess more genuine goodness than anyone I have ever met at court. You, Elsie, belong firmly among the latter. They remained together until the last light of day faded completely, Elsie reluctantly rising at last to make her way back to the inn before her prolonged absence drew unwanted attention. As she walked back across the darkening fields, she found herself thinking not of the danger they faced, nor of the soldiers searching relentlessly for Alden, but of the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her, the genuine affection that seemed to grow stronger between them with each passing conversation. She did not yet understand what this connection meant, or where it might lead them both once the immediate danger had passed, but she knew, with growing certainty, that whatever happened next, her life had been irrevocably changed by the storm that had brought a wounded stranger to her door. 3 nights later, Elsie woke to the sound of frantic knocking on the door of her small room above the stables. She sat up immediately, alarm coursing through her, and rushed to open it, finding Hannah standing outside, breathless and pale in the moonlight. Elsie, come quickly, Hannah gasped. There is a man near the eastern fields, collapsed by the old shepherd's hut. I was walking back from my sister's cottage when I heard him crying out. I think he is very ill. Elsie's heart dropped into her stomach. She grabbed her shawl and followed Hannah out into the cold night air, praying desperately that Alden's condition had not worsened, that this was not the disaster she feared. As they hurried across the fields, She tried to think of some explanation she could offer, some way to protect the secret she had guarded so carefully for nearly 2 weeks. When they reached the hut, Elsie found Alden lying on the ground outside, his body shaking with fever, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold night air. His wound, she realized with growing horror, had become infected after all. The herbs and simple treatments she had provided ultimately insufficient against whatever sickness now ravaged his body. "We need to get him proper help," Hannah said urgently, kneeling beside him and pressing a hand to his burning forehead. "He needs a physician, Elsie, not just herbs and bandages." "I know," Elsie said, her mind racing desperately for a solution that would not immediately expose Alden to the soldiers still searching for him throughout the region. But looking at his pale, sweating face, hearing his labored breathing, she realized there was no longer any choice. If they did not get him proper medical attention immediately, the fever alone might kill him before morning. "Help me carry him to the inn," she said finally, her voice trembling with the weight of the decision. "Mrs. Dawson keeps medicine for fever in the kitchen storeroom. It will not be as good as a true physician, but it may be enough to bring the fever down until we can find something better." Together, the two young women managed to help Alden to his feet, though he could barely stand, his body racked with chills despite the heat radiating from his fevered skin. They half carried, half dragged him back across the fields, moving as quickly as his weakened condition allowed, both of them straining under the effort. They had nearly reached the inn when the sound of approaching horses reached Elsie's ears, and her blood ran cold. She looked up to see torchlight bobbing along the main road, drawing closer with alarming speed. A night patrol, searching the countryside even in the darkness, and they were heading directly toward the inn. "Quickly," Elsie hissed, pulling Alden toward the side entrance rather than risk being seen at the front of the building. Hannah, understanding the danger without needing further explanation, helped support Alden's weight as they hurried toward the shadows near the kitchen door. They had barely made it inside when Elsie heard the heavy pounding of fists against the front door of the inn, followed by Captain Voss's commanding voice demanding entry in the name of the crown. Panic surged through her chest as she realized there was nowhere left to hide him, no time to return him to the safety of the distant hut. "The cellar," Hannah whispered urgently, "quickly, before Mrs. Dawson answers the door." They rushed Alden down the narrow stairs into the inn's cellar, settling him behind a stack of old crates and barrels in the darkest corner, far from the entrance. Elsie pressed a hand against his burning forehead, whispering urgent words for him to stay silent, no matter what he heard above them. His eyes, glassy with fever, met hers with a flicker of understanding before she hurried back up the stairs, Hannah close behind her. They emerged into the kitchen just as Mrs. Dawson, roused from her bed and wrapped in a nightgown, opened the front door to admit Captain Voss and several of his soldiers. Elsie forced herself to appear calm, busying herself with mundane kitchen tasks as the soldiers began a thorough search of the inn, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Her heart pounded so violently, she feared the soldiers might hear it as they moved through the building, growing ever closer to the kitchen and the cellar door beyond. When one soldier reached for the cellar door handle, Elsie felt certain her entire world was about to collapse. "Wait," she said suddenly, stepping forward before she could stop herself. "The cellar floods this time of year, from the recent rains. It is not safe to descend without a proper light. Let me fetch a lantern first." The soldier hesitated, glancing toward his captain for guidance. Captain Voss studied Elsie for a long moment, his sharp eyes seeming to search her face for any sign of deception. She held his gaze steadily, praying her fear did not show as clearly as it felt within her chest. "Fetch the lantern quickly, then," Captain Voss said finally, though his tone remained suspicious. "We will search every corner of this inn before we move on." Elsie hurried to retrieve a lantern, her mind racing desperately for some way to prevent the search from revealing Alden's hiding place. As she returned to the kitchen, an idea struck her, born of desperation rather than careful planning. "Captain," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "forgive my boldness, but I could not help overhearing that you search for a nobleman, wounded in an ambush some weeks ago. My mother lives at the edge of the village, and she has been quite ill. Just yesterday she mentioned seeing strange lights near the old mill, well beyond the eastern fields. Perhaps that might be worth investigating, if you have not already searched there." It was a desperate gamble, sending the soldiers on a false trail far from both the hut and the inn itself. Captain Voss studied her carefully, and for a terrifying moment, Elsie feared he saw through her deception entirely. But then he nodded slowly, gesturing to his men. "We will investigate this old mill," he said. "But know this, girl, if I learn you have deliberately misled the Crown's soldiers in our search, the punishment will be severe." "I would never dream of such deception, Captain," Elsie said, forcing her expression into one of innocent helpfulness despite the terror pounding through her veins. "I only wish to help however I can." The soldiers departed shortly after, their torches disappearing into the darkness as they made their way toward the old mill, far from where Alden actually lay hidden. Elsie sagged against the kitchen counter, relief and exhaustion washing over her in equal measure, while Mrs. Dawson watched her with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "What was that about, girl?" Mrs. Dawson asked sharply. "You seemed remarkably eager to redirect the captain's search." "I simply wished them to leave quickly, so we might return to sleep," Elsie said, hoping her employer would accept the simple explanation. Mrs. Dawson studied her for a long moment, before finally shrugging and retreating back toward her own quarters, apparently too tired to press the matter further that night. Once certain the coast was clear, Elsie and Hannah rushed back to the cellar, finding Alden still hidden behind the crates, his fever showing no signs of breaking despite their narrow escape from discovery. They worked quickly, applying cool cloths to his forehead and administering what fever remedies Mrs. Dawson kept stored for the occasional ill traveler. It was during this frantic effort to save him that Hannah, adjusting the blanket covering Alden's shoulders, noticed something that made her freeze entirely. A ring on his finger, previously hidden beneath his sleeve, had become visible in the lantern light, a heavy gold band bearing an intricate crest that Hannah clearly recognized. "That crest," Hannah whispered, her eyes wide with sudden understanding. "Elsie, that is the seal of the House of Ashvale. I have seen it before, on coins that passed through the village, on the banners that flew when the old Duke visited these lands years ago." Elsie felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "The Duke of Ashvale," she repeated slowly, the pieces finally falling into place. She had known Alden was a nobleman, had known he held some position of power and importance, but she had never imagined he might be the Duke himself, one of the most powerful figures in the entire kingdom, second only to the royal family itself. "He is the one they said was missing," Hannah continued, her voice hushed with a mixture of fear and awe. "I heard it whispered among the soldiers, though they would not confirm it directly. The Duke of Ashvale, ambushed on the road, presumed dead by many already." Elsie stared down at Alden, still lost in the grip of fever, his identity now fully revealed in ways she had never anticipated. All this time, she had been caring for one of the most powerful men in the entire kingdom, sharing her last candle with him, risking her position and safety to protect him, without ever fully understanding the magnitude of who she had taken into her care. A complicated mixture of emotions swept through her, relief that his identity had finally been confirmed, mixed with something that felt uncomfortably close to hurt. He had allowed her to believe he was simply a nobleman in danger, had never once corrected her assumptions or revealed the true extent of his position, even as their connection had deepened over the past weeks. "We cannot tell anyone," Elsie said firmly, pushing aside her complicated feelings in favor of practical concern. "If word spreads that the Duke is here, injured and vulnerable, it will draw far more attention than we can safely manage, from both those who wish to help him and those who orchestrated his ambush in the first place." Hannah nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the secret they now shared. Together, they worked through the remainder of the night to bring down Alden's fever, applying cool compresses and forcing small sips of water and medicine between his cracked lips whenever he grew lucid enough to swallow. By dawn, the fever had finally begun to break, his breathing growing steadier, his skin cooler to the touch. Elsie sat exhausted beside him, watching the first light of morning filter through the small cellar window, her mind still reeling from the revelation of his true identity. When Alden finally woke fully, his eyes clearer than they had been in days, he found Elsie watching him with an expression he could not immediately read, a complicated mixture of relief and something more guarded than she had shown him before. "You know," he said quietly, noticing the ring now visible on his hand, understanding immediately what had happened while he lay lost in fever. "Yes," Elsie confirmed, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I know now, Alden. Or should I say, Your Grace. Duke of Ashvale." He winced at the formal title, hearing the hurt buried beneath her carefully controlled tone. "Elsie, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" she said, standing abruptly, needing distance to process the whirlwind of emotions crashing through her. "That you allowed me to believe you were simply a nobleman in trouble, while never once mentioning you were among the most powerful men in this entire kingdom. That you let me risk everything, my position, my safety, perhaps even my life, without ever giving me the full truth of what I was truly risking it for." "I was trying to protect you," Alden said, struggling to sit up despite his weakened state. "The more you knew, the more danger you would be in, should anyone learn of your involvement. I never meant to deceive you out of malice, Elsie. I swear it." "Perhaps not malice," Elsie said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. But deception nonetheless. Do you understand what it means, Alden? To learn that the man I have cared for, the man I have shared conversations with as though we were equals, is in truth a duke? A man whose life is worlds apart from mine, who will return to his estates and his wealth and his position, while I remain here, a simple maid who happened to share her last candle with someone far beyond her station? Alden's expression grew pained, though whether from his physical wound or her words, Elsie could not entirely tell. Nothing about my position changes what has happened between us these past weeks, he said earnestly. The conversations we shared, the care you provided, none of that was diminished by my failure to reveal my full title. If anything, it means more to me precisely because you offered such kindness without any knowledge of what I might have been able to give you in return. That is easy for you to say, Elsie replied, bitterness creeping into her voice despite her best efforts to remain calm. You speak as though station means nothing, but we both know that is not true. When you return to your world, Alden, to your estates and your responsibilities as Duke, what place will remain for a maid who once nursed you back to health? You will move on, as men of your position always do, and I will remain here, exactly as I was before you arrived. That is not what I intend, Alden said, his voice growing firmer despite his weakened condition. Elsie, please believe me when I say that what has grown between us these past weeks means more to me than anything I possessed before this ambush occurred. I do not intend to simply disappear back into my former life and forget the debt I owe you, nor the connection we have formed. But Elsie, hurt and overwhelmed by the sudden revelation of his true identity, found herself unable to fully trust his words in that moment. The gap between their stations felt suddenly vast and insurmountable, a chasm she had not fully considered until confronted with the reality of exactly how powerful and important Alden truly was. You need to leave, she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. Once you have recovered enough strength to travel safely, you must go, Alden. Return to your estates, reclaim your position, deal with whatever conspiracy threatens your life. I will not ask anything more of you, and I would ask that you not promise things you may not be able to fulfill once you return to your true world. Elsie, Alden said, pain evident in his voice at her words, please do not push me away because of fear over what might happen. Give me the chance to prove that my feelings, my gratitude, my intentions toward you are genuine, regardless of the difference in our stations. But Elsie, still reeling from the shock of learning his true identity and the fear of what it meant for whatever connection had grown between them, shook her head firmly. I cannot, she said. Not now. Please, Alden. Simply focus on healing and returning safely to deal with those who threaten your life. That is what matters most right now, not whatever feelings may or may not exist between a duke and a simple maid. She left him then, climbing the cellar stairs with tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, unwilling to let him see how deeply his revelation and her own fear had wounded her. Whatever had grown between them these past weeks now felt fragile and uncertain, overshadowed by the vast difference in their positions that she had somehow managed to forget during their quiet conversations in the shepherd's hut. As she emerged into the early morning light, she wondered if she had made the right choice, pushing away the very connection that had brought unexpected warmth and meaning into her difficult life. But the fear of eventual heartbreak, of watching Alden return to a world where she could never truly belong, felt like a risk she was not yet ready to take. Alden left the inn 8 days later, under cover of darkness, guided by a trusted messenger Elsie had helped him contact through a traveling merchant named Edwin Cole, a man who had once done business with the House of Ashvale and recognized enough of Alden's description to believe his claims without demanding proof that might have exposed him further. Edwin agreed to carry a carefully worded letter to Alden's old friend and steward, a man whose loyalty Alden trusted above all others. And within days, a small discreet party arrived under cover of night to escort the Duke safely away from the village. Elsie watched from the shadows near the stable as Alden was helped into a plain, unmarked carriage. His strength mostly returned, though he still moved with careful caution around his healing wound. He turned back once, searching the darkness as though hoping to catch a final glimpse of her before departing. But Elsie remained hidden, unwilling to face another painful goodbye after the distance that had grown between them since the revelation of his true identity. The weeks that followed felt strangely empty, despite the return of Elsie's normal routine at the inn. She threw herself into her work with renewed determination, caring for her mother each evening, saving what small wages she could toward the medicine that remained frustratingly out of reach. She told herself repeatedly that pushing Alden away had been the wise choice, the only sensible decision given the impossible gap between their stations, yet a persistent ache remained in her chest each time she thought of their quiet conversations in the shepherd's hut, now standing empty and forgotten at the edge of the eastern fields. Word eventually reached the village of dramatic events unfolding at the Ashvale estate, carried by travelers passing through the inn and eagerly discussed among the local gossips. The Duke of Ashvale, presumed dead for weeks, had returned alive and immediately exposed a plot against his life, orchestrated by his own cousin, a man named Garrick Ashvale, who had grown impatient waiting for succession and had conspired with several corrupt guards to arrange the ambush on the road. Garrick had been arrested, his co-conspirators rounded up swiftly, and order had been restored to the Duke's household within days of his dramatic return. Elsie listened to these stories with a strange mixture of relief and lingering sadness. Relief that Alden had survived, that justice had been served against those who tried to end his life. But sadness, that despite everything they had shared, he had made no attempt to contact her since his departure. Perhaps, she thought bitterly, this confirmed exactly what she had feared, that once returned to his proper world of wealth and power, a simple maid who had once shared her last candle with him, held no lasting place in his memory. Nearly 6 weeks after Alden's departure, on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, Elsie was scrubbing the front steps of the inn when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. She looked up to see a magnificent carriage, far grander than any that typically passed through their small village, its sides bearing an elegant crest she now recognized immediately as belonging to the House of Ashvale. Her heart began to race as the carriage came to a stop directly in front of the inn, drawing curious onlookers from throughout the village who had gathered to witness the unusual sight of such nobility visiting their humble establishment. Mrs. Dawson rushed forward, flustered and eager to please whatever important guest had arrived, straightening her apron and calling out for the staff to prepare the finest room available. Elsie remained frozen on the steps, her scrub brush forgotten in her hand, as the carriage door opened and a footman stepped down to assist the passenger inside. She recognized him immediately, despite the fine new clothes that had replaced the torn, bloodied garments he had worn during their first meeting, despite the healthy color that had returned to his face and the confident bearing that now marked his every movement. Alden stepped down from the carriage, his eyes immediately scanning the small crowd that had gathered until they found her, standing frozen on the steps of the inn. Something in his expression softened visibly upon seeing her, relief and warmth mixing together as he made his way directly toward her, ignoring the murmurs and gasps rippling through the assembled onlookers. "Elsie," he said, stopping before her, close enough that she could see the genuine emotion in his eyes. "I have thought of nothing but you these past weeks." "Your Grace," Elsie said, her voice barely above a whisper, uncertain how to address him now, surrounded by witnesses and the full weight of his true position, finally made visible through the grandeur of his carriage and clothing. "I did not expect to see you again." "Did you truly believe I would simply disappear from your life?" Alden asked. "After everything you did for me, after you saved my life, hid me from those who wished me harm, risked your own safety and position to nurse me back to health? I told you before I left that I would not forget the debt I owe you, Elsie, nor the feelings that grew between us during those weeks in the shepherd's hut." Elsie felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden reality of his presence, by the words she had convinced herself she would never hear spoken aloud. "I pushed you away," she said quietly. "I told you to leave and not make promises you might not keep. I feared exactly this, that once you returned to your proper world, there would be no place remaining for someone like me." "You were wrong," Alden said gently, taking her hand in his despite the growing crowd of onlookers watching their exchange with rapt fascination. "These past 6 weeks, dealing with the aftermath of my cousin's betrayal, restoring order to my household, ensuring justice was properly served, I thought of you constantly. Every difficult decision I faced, every moment of doubt or exhaustion, I found myself remembering your words, your kindness, the way you shared your last candle with a dying stranger simply because it was the right thing to do." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, carefully wrapped package, pressing it gently into her free hand. "I promised you once," he continued, "that if I survived and returned to my position, securing your mother's health would be among my first priorities. Inside that package, you will find enough to purchase the finest medicine available, along with the services of the best physician in the kingdom, who has already agreed to travel to your village and provide ongoing care for your mother for as long as necessary." Elsie's hands trembled as she unwrapped the package, finding inside a substantial sum of money along with a formal letter bearing an official seal, confirming arrangements already made for her mother's medical treatment. She looked up at Alden, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his gesture, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "This is too much," she whispered. "Alden, I cannot accept something so generous." "You can, and you will," Alden said firmly, though his tone remained gentle. "This is not charity, Elsie, nor is it payment for services rendered. This is simply the beginning of what I intend to offer you, if you will allow me the chance." He lowered himself to one knee then, right there on the steps of the inn, before the gathered crowd of villagers whose murmurs had fallen into stunned, expectant silence. Elsie stared down at him, her heart pounding so loudly she felt certain everyone present could hear it. "Elsie Hartley," Alden said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "you found me broken and dying in a storm, a stranger with nothing to offer you but danger and uncertainty. You shared your last candle with me, gave me warmth when you had barely enough for yourself, and asked for nothing in return except my safety. In doing so, you showed me more genuine kindness than I have encountered in my entire life, surrounded by wealth and privilege. I do not wish to simply repay that kindness with gifts and gestures. I wish to spend the rest of my life earning the honor of standing beside someone whose heart proved so much larger than the modest circumstances of her birth." He reached into his coat once more, withdrawing a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring far more elegant than anything Elsie had ever seen, its design clearly matching the crest she now recognized as belonging to the House of Ashvale. "Will you do me the honor," Alden continued, his voice steady despite the obvious emotion behind his words, "of becoming my wife and Duchess of Ashvale? I cannot promise you a life free of challenges, particularly given the difference in our stations that will undoubtedly draw criticism from some corners of society, but I can promise you my complete devotion, my unwavering respect, and a partnership built on the same honesty and genuine care that first drew us together during those difficult weeks following the ambush." The crowd around them had grown completely silent, every villager holding their breath as they watched this extraordinary scene unfold before them. A scene that would undoubtedly become the stuff of local legend for generations to come. Elsie looked down at Alden, at the sincerity radiating from his every word and expression, and felt the last of her doubts and fears finally dissolve into certainty. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Yes, Alden, I will marry you." The crowd erupted into cheers and applause as Alden rose to his feet, slipping the ring onto her finger before pulling her into an embrace that spoke of relief, joy, and months of longing finally fulfilled. Mrs. Dawson, standing nearby with tears streaming down her own face, could scarcely believe that the humble maid who had worked tirelessly in her inn for years was now destined to become a duchess, her life transformed entirely by a single act of selfless kindness offered during a terrible storm. The wedding took place 2 months later at the grand estate of Ashvale, though Elsie insisted on including many elements from her humble background within the ceremony, from simple wildflowers gathered from the eastern fields near the old shepherd's hut, to candles lit throughout the hall in honor of the single flame that had first brought them together. Her mother, now receiving proper medical treatment and growing stronger with each passing week, was carried to the ceremony on a specially arranged carriage, tears of joy and pride streaming down her face as she watched her daughter exchange vows with the Duke of Ashvale. Hannah, who had helped protect their secret during those dangerous early days, stood proudly among the wedding party, having been offered a permanent position within the Ashvale household as a reward for her loyalty and courage. Edwin Cole, the merchant who had helped carry word to Alden's loyal friends, was granted favorable trading privileges throughout the Duke's territories, his assistance during the crisis never forgotten. As for Elsie herself, she settled into her new role as Duchess with the same quiet grace and genuine warmth that had first captured Alden's heart, using her position to establish charitable programs throughout the region that provided medical care and support to families who could not otherwise afford such assistance, remembering always the desperate circumstances that had once made proper medicine feel impossibly out of reach for her own mother. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had first met, Alden would smile and tell the story of a terrible storm, a desperate escape from those who wished him harm, and a poor maid who had shared her very last candle with a wounded stranger, never once suspecting that the man she saved would one day make her his duchess. It was, he always insisted, the truest proof that genuine kindness, offered freely and without expectation of reward, held the power to change not just individual lives, but the very course of destiny itself. And though the danger and uncertainty of those early weeks had long since faded into cherished memory, Elsie kept one small reminder of where their story had truly begun, a simple candle, carefully preserved and displayed within a place of honor in their home, a quiet testament to the night when her small act of compassion had illuminated far more than just a darkened room, but had ultimately illuminated an entire lifetime of love, partnership, and shared purpose that neither of them could have possibly imagined on that stormy evening when fate first brought them together.